Hello. Thank you for dialing back into our Moments with the Pastor. I wanted to talk very briefly this morning about a verse that's really impacted me. In fact, you might say that it's one of my life verses. That's something that my generation was encouraged to do, and most of us picked a couple verses that we really kind of tried to build our Christian life around. And the one that has meant a lot to me is from the 13th chapter of Acts, where Paul is writing about King David. And he said, "And David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid with the fathers and saw corruption." Of course, he's writing about the difference between David, who saw corruption, who rotted in the grave, and Christ, who served the purposes of God in his time, but did not see corruption, rose from the dead. But it is significant that Paul says that David had this perspective. He wanted to serve the purpose of God in his own generation. And then he was going to die. And he was going to see corruption. And I remember reading that as a brand new Christian. I've only been a Christian maybe a year and a half. And I was thinking about going into the ministry. I met Jane, and we were engaged, and I was on a retreat, and I was reading through Acts, and those verses just jumped out at me. I remember in my old Bible I underlined those verses and put the date beside it. And I have tried to focus on that what I'm called to do is simply this: as a minister or as a Christian, as an officer in the church, as a missionary, as a mother or father, as a man whose calling is out in the mission of the community as he does his work, that I only have one responsibility, and that's to serve the purposes of God in my own time, in my own generation. Now, what's interesting about this verse is the word generation, which in biblical way of thinking, both Old Testament, New Testament, means about 40 years. And I have reached the 40-year mark next year. I will have been ordained 40 years. And I'm retired. And I can see almost day by day how the younger men are coming along, and they know how to serve the purpose of God in this generation better than I do. And I'm going to die. I think about that a lot more now than I did 20 years ago. And I'm going to see corruption. And a lot of the things that I invested in are going to go the way of corruption. They're just not going to survive because they were temporary, generational, and certainly just for this world. And I think that's a good perspective for us who are the older members of the church and the newer members as well, younger people. We share this conviction that we are called to Christ and to this church and into whatever vocations we have for only one purpose, and that's to serve the purposes of God, to follow Jesus Christ, to be an instrument of the Spirit to the people that we have in our own generation. And that's a good reminder as we get ready to receive a new pastor. This man is younger, more than likely, than I am. He's going to have much more sympathy with and knowledge about and affinity with this younger generation and the world now in 2021 that wasn't that way in 1982 when I started in ministry. And we need to let him lead, let him take us into a new generation. And perhaps the purpose of God looks a little different, feels a little differently. But it's really the same as when we began as a church back in 1979 or so. It's to serve the purposes of God by reaching people for Christ, by worshiping as a community of believers and building each other up, and glorifying God in our worship and the things we do. So maybe it's a good time for you as an older person to think back and say, how did I do in serving the purposes of God in my own generation? Because as long as you're alive, your generation isn't dead. And as a young person, rather than perhaps be critical of the older people and what they did, be sympathetic to them and say, they served a different generation than we do. Our job is not to criticize them, but to take hold of the lessons they've learned and apply them in a creative way to reaching a generation that's very, very different from the one that our parents and grandparents served. Praise God for using us in ministry, for giving us a life, a generation, and for reminding us that the things we do pass away except for the three things that never pass away: our God, His Word, and the souls of people that we have an opportunity to reach for Christ. God bless you, Have a good week, and we'll see you on the Moment with the Pastors later on this month.